There is something at the bottom of the North Sea that has no name in any living language. Not because it was never named, it was named, certainly, by the people who lived there, who walked its river valleys and camped beside its lakes and followed its coastlines and buried their dead in its soil. But the names they gave it died with them, or rather sank with them, 10,000 years ago, as the sea rose slowly around the edges of their world and swallowed everything they knew. We call it Doggerland now, after the Dogger Bank, the shallow underwater plateau that was once its highest ground. The name is ours, not theirs. It is the name we gave to a place we discovered only after it was gone. I think about this often, the fact that the first great civilization of northwestern Europe has no name in its own language. Every other lost world we can speak about carries something of itself forward. The ruins, the inscriptions, the objects buried with the dead, the occasional text that survived in a copy of a copy. But Doggerland left almost nothing above the waterline. What it left is below the North Sea, in the sediment, in the peat beds that the trawlers sometimes drag up from the bottom, and in the bones and tools that occasionally come up with the mud, blinking into the light of a world that does not recognize them. A Mesolithic harpoon point, still sharp after 9,000 years. A fragment of worked bone, the molar of a mammoth, not yet extinct when these people were alive. These things surface sometimes in the nets of the fishing boats working the Dogger Bank, and the fishermen, if they know what they have, set them aside, and eventually the objects find their way to a museum, where they sit in a case and say, quietly, to anyone who takes the time to look, "We were there. I want to go there. I want to take you there, not to the bottom of the sea, but to the place as it was, before the water came." Because Doggerland was not a marginal place, not a peripheral zone at the edge of the habitable world. It was, for the people who lived in it during the period we call the Mesolithic, roughly 12,000 to 7,000 years before the present, one of the richest environments in northwestern Europe. It was a landscape of rivers and wetlands and forests and coastal plains, abundant in fish and game and wild plant foods, sheltered enough for year-round habitation in some areas, open enough for the seasonal movements of the animals that the hunter-gatherer communities followed. It was home. It was, for many generations of people, the only world they knew or needed to know. We know this from the seafloor. Marine geologists and archaeologists have spent the last several decades mapping the submerged landscape of the North Sea, using the same sonar and sampling techniques that oil companies use to understand the geology beneath the water. What they have found is a landscape in extraordinary detail. River channels, lake beds, coastlines, beaches, even the subtle topographic variations that indicate different ecological zones. The rivers that once flowed across Doggerland are still there, etched into the seafloor, their valleys and meanders preserved in the sediment exactly as they were when the last water flowed through them, 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. The Thames and the Rhine and the Elbe once joined in the middle of what is now the southern North Sea, and flowed together northward as a single enormous river system to an estuary somewhere near the present Norwegian coast. That river system is still visible in the seafloor topography, a ghost of hydrology in the mud. What the landscape was like in the warm period just after the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers had retreated and the climate had shifted towards something recognizable as temperate, is something we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence. The early Doggerland would have been a mosaic of environments, open grassland where the glaciers had recently retreated, giving way to birch and pine forest as the climate continued to warm, and then eventually to the mixed deciduous woodland, oak, hazel, lime, elm, that characterizes the Atlantic period of the Holocene, the warm, wet climatic phase that produced the richest conditions northwestern Europe has experienced in the last 20,000 years. The rivers were full of salmon and trout and eels. The coastal zones, and Doggerland had an extensive coastline facing north and west onto the open Atlantic, would have been rich in seabirds, seals, shellfish, and the occasional stranded whale, all of which left evidence in the middens, the rubbish heaps that occasionally survive in the waterlogged conditions of the now submerged landscape. The animals. In the Mesolithic period of northwestern Europe, the megafauna, the large animals that the Ice Age hunters had pursued, were in the process of disappearing, partly from climate change as the forest closed in and reduced the open grassland habitat they required, and partly, almost certainly, from human hunting pressure. The mammoth was still present in the early Mesolithic in some areas, though it was clearly in decline. The woolly rhinoceros was gone, but there were still aurochs, the enormous wild cattle that were the ancestors of domestic cattle, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with horns spanning over a meter. Red deer, which were the primary large prey animal for Mesolithic hunters across Europe, were abundant. Wild boar in the forest. Beavers in every river, whose dams created the wetland ponds that were excellent fishing grounds. Brown bears and wolves and lynx, the top predators that shared the landscape with the human hunters. Horses, still wild in this period, moving in herds across the more open areas. This was the world that the Doggerland people inhabited. The communities that lived there were not, by any stretch of the term, primitive. They were specialists in the knowledge of their specific landscape, in the seasonal movements of the animals they hunted, in the identification and processing of the plant foods available at different times of year, in the making of the tools and containers and clothing that their lives required. The stone tools of the Mesolithic, the microliths, the tiny precision-flaked flints that were hafted in wooden or bone handles to make composite tools, required a sophisticated technical knowledge to produce. The boats that the coastal communities used to fish and to move along the coastline, hide boats, almost certainly, or dugout canoes, the wood long since rotted in most sites, but their existence implied by the presence of deep-water fish species in the middens, required knowledge of boat building and seamanship that took years to acquire. These were not people who lived in the landscape. They were people who understood it in the specific, granular, accumulated way that only comes from a relationship between a community and a place that is measured in generations. Let me try to give you a specific day, imagined from the evidence, in Doggerland perhaps 9,000 years ago, in the middle period of the site's human occupation, before the sea level rise had significantly reduced the available land. We are in early autumn, the season when the salmon are running up the rivers and the hazelnuts are ripe and the red deer are beginning to move for the rut. The community that lives here, perhaps 20 or 30 people, a band of the size that makes ecological sense for mobile hunter-gatherers in a rich environment, is camped beside a river, somewhere in what is now the southern North Sea, in a location that the salmon and the hazelnuts have made obvious. The camp is not elaborate. The Mesolithic people of northwestern Europe did not build permanent structures of the kind that survive archaeologically, in the way that later farming communities' houses do. They built light shelters, frameworks of poles covered with hides or bark or woven rushes, designed to be erected and dismantled in a morning, because the mobility that their way of life required made permanence a liability. But the camp has been used before, probably by this same community or its predecessors, because there are signs of repeated use in the landscape. A level area where the ground has been cleared and compacted by many previous camps, a stone-lined fire pit that has been used many times, a scatter of flint-napping debris where tool-making has been done repeatedly over years or decades. This is not a random stopping place. It is a known place, a named place, a place in the community's mental map of their territory that is associated with this season and these resources and these activities. A man is in the river at first light. He is perhaps 35 years old for a Mesolithic hunter. The skeletal evidence suggests an average life expectancy that makes our modern calculations look pampered. And he is standing mid-thigh in cold moving water, holding a spear made from a straight ash shaft, tipped with a harpoon point of worked antler, watching the water downstream with the absolute stillness of a practiced hunter waiting for the fish to come to him rather than chasing them. The salmon run has been going for a week. The river is dark, with them at the right time of day, the great fish pushing upstream in the purposeful confusion of their spawning drive, and a patient man who knows where to stand can take several in an hour. He has done this every autumn of his adult life. His father showed him where to stand and when to be still, and how to read the water surface for the signs of fish moving below. His father's father showed his father. The knowledge goes back further than any of them can name. The women of the camp are at the hazel thickets a short walk from the river, harvesting. The hazelnuts are ripe now, falling from the catkins at a touch, and the harvest is measured in the fibre bags and skin pouches that the women carry, filling and emptying into the larger containers that will be cached or carried back to wherever the community spends the winter. Hazel was not merely a food in the Mesolithic, it was a staple, a reliable high-calorie source that could be dried and stored for months, one of the few plant foods that provided this kind of nutrition and shelf life in the pre-farming European diet. The hazel thickets are not accidents of the landscape. They are managed, the evidence of coppicing, the deliberate cutting of hazel stems to encourage new growth and denser nut production, appears in some Mesolithic archaeological sites, suggesting that these communities were manipulating their environment in sophisticated ways that fall short of farming, but are very far from simple foraging. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, is supposed to be helping with the hazel harvest, but has drifted toward the edge of the thicket where the forest begins. The forest is darker and quieter than the open ground by the river, and the child is at an age where the boundary between the familiar and the unknown begins to exert its pull. The adults in her community have been teaching her the forest since she could walk, teaching her which mushrooms are edible and which are dangerous, which tracks belong to which animals, how to move quietly, how to watch and listen before you reveal yourself. She is applying this knowledge now, standing very still at the edge of the trees, watching a red squirrel on a branch above her that has not yet noticed her presence. The squirrel and the child regard each other across a small distance that is also the distance between the human world and the animal world, and then the squirrel flicks its tail and is gone, and the child stands for a moment in the quality of the empty branch before turning back to the hazelnuts. This is the world. These are the people. They are not primitive, not simple, not empty of interior life. They are fully human, in every meaningful sense, intelligent, knowledgeable about their landscape, organized into communities that provided for their members, capable of abstract thought and symbolic expression, almost certainly possessed of rich oral traditions of story and song and memory, connected to the landscape around them by a web of practical knowledge and mythological association that was the equivalent, in its depth and its function, of the religious and philosophical traditions of literate civilizations. We know they were capable of symbolic thought because of the objects they made that served no purely practical function. The carved antler objects decorated with geometric patterns, the ochre-stained bones that suggest ritual use, the deliberate burial of the dead, with grave goods in positions that imply belief in something beyond the biological fact of death. We know they travelled long distances and maintained contact with other communities because certain stone types found in Mesolithic sites are not local. Flint from specific outcrops travelled hundreds of miles through exchange networks we can only partially reconstruct. We know they had boats because islands that were never connected to the mainland even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age have Mesolithic occupation sites, which means people crossed open water to get there. What we do not know, what the silence of an illiterate tradition imposes, is the content of their minds, their names, their stories, their understanding of the sky and the seasons and the movements of the animals that sustained them, their cosmology, their explanation for why the world was the way it was, who made it, what obligations that made on the humans who lived within it. All of this is gone, not because it did not exist, but because it existed only in spoken language, and spoken language leaves no trace when the speakers are gone. This is the particular silence of Doggerland, not the silence of a burned library, where we know what was lost. The silence of a world that never wrote anything down, whose entire intellectual and spiritual heritage existed only in the minds and mouths of the people who drowned with it, or rather, and this matters, this distinction matters, whose descendants dispersed as the water rose, carrying some of what they knew with them into the surrounding populations of Europe, where it dissolved into other traditions and left no identifiable trace. Now, the sea. The sea did not come all at once. This is the other thing that is hardest to hold in the mind about Doggerland's end. Not one tsunami, not one day when everything was lost, but a process that lasted 4,000 years. From approximately 12,000 years ago to approximately 8,000 years ago, the sea level in the North Sea region rose by roughly 50 meters, as the glaciers of the last ice age continued to melt, and the meltwater found its way to the ocean. 50 meters over 4,000 years, that is an average of about 1¼ centimeters per year. Not dramatic, in any given year or decade or even generation. The rate was not constant. There were periods of faster rise and slower rise, periods when the rate nearly halted and then accelerated again, but the direction was constant, always higher, never lower. What this meant for the communities living in Doggerland was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, relentless erosion of the world. In any given generation, the changes might have been barely perceptible. A river mouth that had moved, a beach that was narrower than the old people remembered, an island that had been connected to the mainland and was now separated by a shallow channel that could be waded at low tide. The changes would have been part of the background awareness of communities that paid close attention to their landscape, that noticed the difference between this autumn's hazel yield and last autumn's, that tracked the movements of the salmon and the deer with the precision of people whose lives depended on that tracking. They would have noticed the sea coming. They could not have understood it as a process. There was no framework in which to understand that the ice far away was melting and the ocean was rising. But they would have noticed the encroachment, the high tide marks moving, the marshes spreading, the low-lying land going wet in seasons when it had been dry before, and they adapted. This is what human communities do. They moved. The communities in the lower, more vulnerable areas relocated to higher ground. The fishing communities that had worked the wide, shallow lagoons found new fishing grounds as the lagoons became bays and then open sea. The hunters who had pursued game on the now submerged lowland plains followed the animals to the higher ground that remained. The land area available to the Doggerland communities was shrinking with each generation, but it was not shrinking at a rate that demanded immediate catastrophic response. It was shrinking at the rate of lived experience, which is the rate that human beings are actually capable of adapting to. We can trace this adaptation in the archaeological record, to the limited extent that the record survives. The sites that are earliest and lowest, the sites that would have been on the coast or in the lowlands in the earliest period, disappear earliest from the archaeological record, because they were inundated first. The sites that survive longest are the highest, the chalk ridges and limestone plateaus of England and France, the uplands of what are now Scotland and Scandinavia. The population of the region as a whole did not suddenly disappear. It shifted, it contracted onto the remaining land. The communities that had spread widely across the rich lowland environment compressed onto the uplands and the narrowing coasts, and the density of human settlement on the remaining land may actually have increased as the total land area shrank. But compression has limits, and sometime around 8,000 years ago, 8,200 years before the present, to be as precise as the current evidence allows, something happened that was not gradual. It was the Storegga Slide. On the continental shelf off the coast of Norway, an enormous underwater landslide, one of the largest known in the geological record, involving a section of the seafloor some 300 kilometers wide, displaced a volume of water that generated a tsunami. The wave traveled southward into the North Sea and hit what remained of the Doggerland coast with a force and height that we can estimate from the geological evidence. A layer of sand and marine sediment deposited well above the contemporary sea level, found in sites across Scotland and eastern England and possibly southern Scandinavia, marks the passage of the wave. The tsunami would have been enormous in the shallow North Sea, perhaps 10 to 20 meters high in some areas, sweeping inland for miles across the low-lying landscape that was all that remained of Doggerland by this point. The Storegga Slide tsunami did not end Doggerland by itself. The land was already largely gone by the time the wave hit, and what remained was already marginal. But it almost certainly killed people. Communities that were camped on the low ground near the coast, communities that had no warning and no way of understanding what the sudden withdrawal of the sea and then the roaring approach of the wave meant, would have had very little chance of survival. The wave would have been a final catastrophe. Not the end of a long decline, but a sudden, violent punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been many thousands of years in the writing. After the tsunami, the Dogger Bank, the highest remaining land, a shallow plateau in what is now the middle of the North Sea, persisted above water for perhaps another 1,000 years, shrinking as the sea continued to rise. The last people to live in what had once been Doggerland lived on this isolated and diminishing hilltop island, cut off from the mainland communities by the water that had swallowed the low ground between them. What their life was like on that diminishing island, what they knew or understood of the world they were inheriting, what they thought when the storms drove the sea across the flat ground that was their only world, we have no way of knowing. They left nothing above the waterline. The Dogger Bank was underwater by approximately 7,000 years ago. Since then, the North Sea has deepened further, and the bank itself has remained submerged. A shallow area that is productive for fishing because the underwater plateau concentrates nutrients and provides habitat for the bottom-dwelling species that the trawlers target. The fishing boats that work the Dogger Bank are working, in a sense, the same resource as the Mesolithic communities who lived there. The same convergence of geography and biology that made the bank productive above water continues to make it productive below. The fish do not know that the world has been drowned. The fish are simply there, in the water, where the food is. What we are slowly recovering from the seafloor is a picture of the lost world that grows in detail with every new study. The oil and gas industry's seismic surveys of the North Sea, conducted for purely commercial purposes, have produced data that archaeologists are now mining for the information it contains about the submerged landscape. The surveys map the layers of sediment and rock beneath the seafloor, and in those maps the archaeologists can see the ancient landscape features, the river channels, the lake beds, the coastal ridges, that the survey was not designed to find, but which are there nonetheless, preserved in the sediment record. It is as if the oil industry has accidentally produced the most comprehensive archaeological survey ever conducted of the most important lost landscape in European prehistory. From these surveys and from the targeted sampling of promising areas, archaeologists have identified sites where the sediment conditions might have preserved organic material, peat beds, river channel deposits, lake sediments that could contain the evidence of human occupation. The recovery of such material from the seafloor requires specialized vessels and equipment, and it is expensive and technically demanding, but it has been done. Cores of sediment recovered from specific locations have produced pollen records that tell us what plants were growing when, animal bones that tell us what species were present, and occasionally the signs of human presence, charred plant material that indicates fire, worked flint, bone fragments with cut marks that indicate human butchery. A hazel nutshell recovered from the seafloor of the North Sea, radiocarbon dated to 9,000 years ago, contains within its organic material a record of a specific moment in Doggerland's existence. A nut from a hazel tree that grew on the dry land that is now 30 meters below the sea, harvested, or not harvested, simply fallen and preserved in the sediment in the autumn of a year that no calendar records. The nut is a message from a world that has no other way of speaking to us. It says, there was land here, there were trees, there was a season, and in that season hazelnuts ripened and fell. It says almost nothing, it says everything. The human remains that have been recovered from the North Sea are few, but they are haunting. A piece of frontal bone from a human skull, recovered from a trawler's catch in the early 20th century, radiocarbon dated to the Mesolithic period. A fragment of leg bone. These are not from burials, there is no archaeological context for them, no grave goods, no site to excavate. They are simply bones that came up with the rest of the bottom sediment, separated from the rest of the skeletons they once belonged to by 9,000 years of water and pressure and the slow reworking of the seafloor. They belonged to specific people. Those people had names and families and histories. They were part of communities that knew the landscape the bones are now lying in as dry land, as their world. I find myself returning to the bones as I have returned to Sogdak's letter, as I have returned to Constantine on the walls, as I have returned to the light through the 40 windows of the Hagia Sophia. The bones are a kind of minimum, the minimum that survives of a human life, the last readable trace of a specific individual in the world. The skull fragment from the North Sea trawler says, a person. It says no more than that, but a person is not nothing, a person is everything. A person is the whole complicated internal universe of a conscious being, with memories and desires and fears and skills and relationships and a sense of humour, or its absence, and a way of looking at the sky that was specific to them and to no one else. The skull fragment is all that remains of that universe. The skull fragment is in a museum case. The universe is gone. The thing that Doggerland teaches, if it teaches anything in particular, is about the relationship between place and identity. The communities that lived in Doggerland were not visitors to the landscape. They were made by it, in the specific sense that their skills, their knowledge, their seasonal rhythms, their social structures, their very sense of who they were and how the world worked. All of this was formed in response to, and in relationship with, a specific place. When the place went underwater, The communities did not simply move to another place and continue as they had been. They became different communities in different landscapes, with different resources and different challenges, and the specific knowledge that Doggerland had produced, the knowledge of where the salmon ran and where the hazelnuts grew, and what the river did in spring, and what the coast looked like in the winter storms, that knowledge became useless. It was knowledge about a place that no longer existed, and so it disappeared, not destroyed by any hostile force, but simply abandoned because it no longer applied to any landscape anyone could inhabit. This is a kind of loss that is very hard to register, because it is invisible. The people did not disappear. They joined the surrounding populations of Britain and Scandinavia and France and the Low Countries. Their genes persist in the European gene pool, as the genetic analysis of ancient Mesolithic skeletons from around the North Sea region confirms. The people survived, the community survived, in a sense scattered and absorbed but genetically present. What did not survive was the specific local knowledge, the specific relationship with a specific place, the specific way of being human that Doggerland had produced over the 10,000 years of the warm period before the sea came. That is gone as completely as if it had burned. There is a concept in ecology called ecological memory, the stored record of past conditions and past events that a landscape carries in its soils and its plant communities and its animal populations, even when the conditions that produce those things have changed. Old-growth forests of ecological memory in the complex structure of their dead wood and their mycorrhizal networks and their light gap dynamics, which record centuries of particular disturbances and successions. Wetlands of ecological memory in their peat, which is nothing other than the compressed and preserved record of every plant community that has grown and died in that place over the millennia. The North Sea carries ecological memory of Doggerland in the structure of its sea floor, in the peat beds that the trawlers sometimes disturb, in the river channels etched into the sediment. The landscape remembers Doggerland, even though no one who lives above it does. We are beginning to read that memory. The science of underwater archaeology in the North Sea is young and underfunded relative to the scale of what it is attempting, but it is advancing. Every year, new surveys add to the map of the submerged landscape. Every year, new samples from the seafloor add to the picture of what was there and when. Slowly, in fragments and approximations, the world beneath the water is coming back into view. It will never come back completely. The Mesolithic communities of Doggerland did not leave a library for us to find. They left bones and tools and hazelnuts and the traces of fires in the sediment, and that is almost certainly all they will ever leave us. The names of the rivers are gone. The names of the places are gone. The stories are gone. The names of the people are gone. What remains is the physical evidence of human presence in a landscape, and from that physical evidence we construct, with the tools of modern science and modern interpretation, a picture of a world that is necessarily incomplete and necessarily ours rather than theirs, our interpretation of their evidence, our language for their landscape, our grief for their loss. That grief is something I want to examine, because I think it is real and I think it is not sentimental. To feel grief for the loss of Doggerland is not to romanticize a past we cannot know. It is to recognize that when a human community disappears and takes its specific knowledge of a specific place with it, something is lost from the world that cannot be reconstructed from outside. The Doggerland people knew things about the North Sea basin that no one will ever know again, not in the sense of data. We can recover data about the landscape from the sediment, but in the sense of lived knowledge, the knowledge that accumulates in a community over generations and that exists in the practice of a way of life, rather than in any text or object. The knowledge of where the fish run and when, the knowledge of what the light looks like on the water at the right time of year, the knowledge of how the landscape sounds in different seasons and what those sounds mean and what to do about them. This knowledge is gone. What is not gone, what cannot be gone because it is embedded in us, is the capacity for that kind of relationship with a place. Human beings are the kind of animal that forms deep attachments to specific landscapes, that learns specific places and carries that learning across generations, that makes itself at home somewhere and then grieves when that somewhere is taken away. Doggerland is the first and most extreme example of this grief in the human record of northwestern Europe. But it is not the last. Every community that has been displaced from its specific landscape by flood, by conquest, by economic forces, by any of the countless mechanisms by which human beings are separated from the places that made them, has experienced some version of what the Doggerland communities experienced as the water rose. The specific loss is different each time. The structure of the loss is the same. The North Sea is not silent. It is one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the world, teeming with fish and seabirds and the organisms that support them. The ghost of the rich lowland environment that preceded it, transformed by the water into a different but equally productive abundance. The fishermen who work it are, in a sense, the latest in a very long line of people who have drawn their living from the same geography, the same convergence of rivers and nutrients and shallow water that has always made this part of the world rich. They do not think about Doggerland. They think about the weather and the fish and the market price. But sometimes a net comes up with something in it that does not belong. A tooth, dark with age, a fragment of worked bone, a piece of antler shaped into a point by hands that have been underwater for 9,000 years. The fisherman holds it and does not know exactly what to do with it. It is not a fish, it is not debris. It is something from before the sea was here, something from when this was land, from when this depth of water was air, and the floor of the sea was ground on which feet walked. He keeps it, or he does not keep it. There are fishermen who throw such things back, because the sea takes things and the sea keeps things, and who is he to interfere with that? Either way, the object returns to the world or to the water, and the question it raises, what was here, who was here, what did they know and love and lose, remains unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. The sea is rising again. This is not a metaphor or a rhetorical point. It is a geological fact, as real and as measurable as the sea level rise that swallowed Doggerland, and driven by a warming that is in some ways analogous to the warming that ended the last ice age, and in other ways is not analogous at all, because this warming is faster and its cause is us. The communities living on the low coasts of the world today are in some sense in the position of the Doggerland communities 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, living in landscapes that the sea intends to reclaim, on a timescale that is fast enough to be threatening and slow enough to be adapted to. One careful relocation at a time, or denied until the denial becomes impossible. Doggerland was not a failure. The people who lived there did not fail. The landscape failed them, in the sense that the world changed in ways that exceeded the capacity of any human community to resist. They adapted as long as adaptation was possible. They moved when moving was possible. When finally the land was gone, they were gone with it, not dead but dispersed, absorbed into the surrounding world, carrying with them the genetic inheritance of a lineage that had survived in that particular landscape for 10,000 years, and that continues, diluted and unrecognized, in the population of northwestern Europe today. The skull fragment in the museum case, the hazel nut from the seafloor, the harpoon point, still sharp, that came up in a trawler's net. These are the signatures of a world that has no other way of signing its name. They are not much, they are all there is, and in their smallness, in the gap between what they are and what they represent, a whole world, a whole civilization of knowledge and story and relationship with place, compressed into a fragment of bone and a nut and a tool. In that gap lives the grief that I am trying to describe, not the grief of loss exactly, something quieter and more permanent than grief. The acknowledgement that the world is older and deeper and more inhabited than we can fully hold in our minds at once, that beneath the world we live in, there are other worlds, some of them drowned and some of them burned and some of them simply forgotten, and that those worlds were as real to the people who lived in them as our world is to us, and that their loss was as total as ours would be. The North Sea is cold and grey and full of life. Somewhere beneath it, in the sediment, in the peat beds and the river channels and the lake floors, the landscape of Doggerland persists, not as a place anyone can go, not as anything that can be walked or touched or named in its own language, but as a record in the earth of a world that was, for 10,000 years, exactly what a world should be. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me go back to the landscape one more time. Let me try to give it the weight it deserves, because I have moved through it too quickly, sketching its outlines when what the place requires is slowness, the same slowness with which it was inhabited and with which it was lost. The Mesolithic period in northwestern Europe, roughly 12,000 to 5,000 years before the present, with the transition to farming occurring at different times in different places. was not a period of stasis. It was a period of continuous adaptation to a continuously changing environment. The people who lived through it were not living the same life their ancestors had lived. The climate was changing, the vegetation was changing, the animal populations were changing, the coastlines were changing. Every generation inherited a slightly different world from the one their parents had known, and the knowledge required to live in that world required constant updating. The hazelnuts were ripening later than they used to. The salmon were running in different channels as the rivers shifted their courses with the changing hydrology. The deer were moving to higher ground as the lowland forest closed in around their old grazing areas. All of this had to be tracked and understood and responded to by communities that had no way of recording the changes except in the oral traditions that carried the accumulated knowledge of many generations. Which river to fish in which season, which hillside faced south enough for the hazelnuts to ripen early, which beach the seals came to in autumn, the oral tradition. This is what I keep coming back to, what I cannot leave alone, because the oral tradition of the Mesolithic communities of Doggerland is, of all the things that are lost, the most completely inaccessible to us. The tools can be found and handled and their manufacture understood by experimental archaeologists who have learnt to knap flint in the old way. The landscape can be mapped and reconstructed from the sediment evidence. The bones can be analysed and their diet and movement and genetic heritage extracted from them. But the stories that explained why the world was as it was, that encoded the practical knowledge of the landscape in narrative form, that expressed the community's understanding of its own place in the larger order of things, these left no trace. They existed only in the air between mouths and ears, and the air does not keep them. We know that the Mesolithic people had stories. We know this not because we have any evidence of specific stories, but because all human communities have stories, and the Mesolithic communities were fully human. The capacity for narrative is as fundamental to human cognition as the capacity for tool use, and there is no evidence that any human community, at any point in the Mesolithic or before it was lacking in this capacity. The stories existed. They encoded the knowledge of where the salmon ran and how the winter storms behaved, and what the ancestors had done in the difficult years, and what the consequences of breaking the community's rules were. They explained the sky and the seasons and the death of animals and the death of people. They connected the living community to the dead, the ancestors whose bones were sometimes kept and whose presence was acknowledged in the rituals that archaeologists find evidence of in the ochre-stained burial sites and the deliberately placed objects in the graves. None of it survived, not a word, not a phrase, not the name of a god or a river or a season. The most complete silence in the human record of northwestern Europe is the silence of the people who lived in Doggerland. And that silence is not the silence of a people who had nothing to say. It is the silence of a people whose every word was spoken into air that has long since moved on. The archaeology of Starcar in Yorkshire, not a Doggerland site, because Starcar is in Britain proper, on land that has never been submerged, but a Mesolithic site of roughly the same period and character that gives us our best evidence for the kind of life the Doggerland communities led, has produced some of the most evocative objects from this period. The antler headdresses, 21 red deer skull caps, the antlers retained and reshaped, the bone modified to be worn on a human head. What were they for? The answer that archaeologists have converged on, carefully and with appropriate tentativeness, is ritual. The wearing of an animal's head, specifically a red deer's head, with its imposing antlers, in a ceremony that may have involved the symbolic identification of the human wearer with the animal. Shamanic practice, or something we might describe with that word. Understanding that the word brings with it a whole set of assumptions that may not apply to the specific practice these objects were part of, but the antler headdresses tell us something beyond their specific function, which we cannot fully recover. They tell us that the Mesolithic people of this region had a symbolic and ritual life that was elaborate enough to require the creation of specialized objects for its performance. They tell us that the relationship between the human and the animal world was mediated by symbolic practice, by ceremony, by transformation, by the deliberate adoption of the animal's identity in a ritual context. They tell us that these people understood the world as a place in which human beings were not simply predators of animals, but were in a relationship with them that required negotiation, propitiation, acknowledgement. The hunter who killed the red deer did not take it for granted. He understood that the taking required something in return, some form of respect or gratitude or ritual recognition that maintained the relationship between the human world and the animal world in a form that allowed the hunting to continue. This is, in its essence, a religious understanding of the world. Not religion in any institutional sense, not religion with priests and temples and doctrines, but religion in the deepest sense, the sense of a community's understanding of its relationship with the powers and presences that its world contains, and of the obligations that relationship imposes. The Doggerland communities had this understanding. It expressed itself in the antler headdresses and the ochre-stained graves and the careful placement of objects with the dead, and in the practices that no object can express, the spoken words and the enacted rituals that were the real substance of a religion that has left no texts. What would the religion of Doggerland have been about? Speculation, necessarily. But there are patterns in the shamanic and animist traditions that have survived into the historical record in various parts of the world. In Siberia, in the Arctic, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in indigenous America, that give us some sense of the kinds of questions that hunter-gatherer religious traditions tend to organize themselves around. The question of the animal. What is the relationship between the human and the animal, and what does it mean to kill what sustains you? The question of the ancestors. Where do the dead go, and what is their relationship to the living? The question of the landscape. Is the world alive in the way that you are alive, and if so, what are your obligations to it? The question of the extraordinary. How do you explain the fact that sometimes the fish don't come, or the deer disappear, or the weather turns wrong for weeks and the food runs short? The Doggerland communities would have had answers to these questions, not our answers, not the answers of any religious tradition we know, but answers specific to their landscape and their experience, built up over 10,000 years of living in that specific place with those specific resources. The salmon would have been central to any cosmology of this landscape. The salmon that arrived in the rivers each autumn in their thousands, the largest and most reliable single food event of the year, a thing that felt, to the communities who depended on it, like a gift from somewhere beyond the human world. The sea itself would have been central, the sea that provided food and also threatened, the sea that was both resource and limit and mystery. The birds, the extraordinary bird life of the North Sea coast, gannets and puffins and auks and guillemots in their tens of thousands on the sea cliffs, the migratory birds that came from somewhere and went to somewhere, and whose arrivals and departures marked the seasons as reliably as the solstices. All of this would have been woven into a way of understanding the world that was rich and specific and gone. The transition between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, between the world of the hunter-gatherers and the world of the farmers. In northwestern Europe, there is a period of overlap and interaction that archaeologists have been studying for decades and arguing about for longer than that. The farming communities, who arrived in Britain and Scandinavia from the south and east beginning around 6,000 years ago, did not simply replace the Mesolithic communities. The transition was more complex. Some areas seem to show rapid replacement, others show long periods of coexistence. Some Mesolithic communities seem to have adopted farming practices while maintaining elements of the hunter-gatherer way of life. Some farming communities seem to have absorbed Mesolithic individuals or groups and incorporated some of their knowledge. The genetics of the transition are complex in ways that the current research has only begun to clarify. There is indigenous Mesolithic DNA in the European gene pool mixed with the Anatolian farmer DNA that represents the agricultural expansion, but the proportion and the geographic distribution vary in ways that tell a complicated story. What is clear is that some of the Doggerland communities, or their descendants, were among the Mesolithic populations of Britain and Scandinavia when the farming transition began. They brought with them the knowledge and the genetic heritage of a lineage that had lived on the North Sea plain for 10,000 years. They did not, for the most part, retain that identity into the historical record. By the time any writing is done in Britain, roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era, the Mesolithic population has been largely absorbed or replaced by the various waves of incoming populations that the Neolithic and Bronze Age brought. But the absorption was not complete disappearance. Something persisted. There are communities living on the islands of the North Sea today, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Outer Hebrides, the Faroes, whose relationship to the sea and to the landscape has the quality of a very old knowledge, even if the specific content of that knowledge was formed by the Norse settlers of 1,000 years ago, rather than by the Mesolithic communities of 10,000 years ago. The knowledge of how to read the sea in bad weather, the knowledge of where the fish are in which season, the knowledge of how to live on a small piece of land surrounded by a large amount of cold water in ways that are productive rather than merely survivalist. This knowledge is not Doggerland knowledge, it is Norse knowledge, or earlier Pictish knowledge, built up in these specific places by the specific communities that have lived there for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. But it has the same structure, the same relationship between place and knowledge that the Doggerland community's knowledge had. The form persists even if the content has changed. I want to try to give you the quality of the grief, because I have been naming it but not fully feeling it. Let me try to feel it. Let me try to stand in it for a moment before we come back up to the surface. Imagine that you know a place, not just know it in the tourist sense, not just know it as somewhere you have visited and found beautiful, but know it in the deep sense, the sense of having been born there and having learnt it from the people who were born there before you, who learnt it from the people who were born there before them, going back so many generations that the knowledge has lost its individual history and become simply what you know, what everyone knows, what the community knows. You know which side of the hill the hazelnuts grow on. You know where the salmon rest in the deep pool before the falls. You know what the sky looks like when a storm is coming from the northwest, and how long you have before it arrives, and where to take shelter when it does. You know the names of the places, the name of the river, and the name of the hill, and the name of the place where your grandfather's grandfather is buried. And the names carry the knowledge, the way names do, when they are not just labels, but histories. The name of the river means something in your language that describes what the river does in spring. The name of the hill means something about what happened there once, long ago, when the world was different. Now the water comes, not all at once, slowly, over years, over decades, over your lifetime and your children's lifetimes. The river mouth moves, the beach gets narrower, the low ground where the deer used to graze goes wet in the spring and stays wet. You move your camp to higher ground. Your children grow up not knowing the low ground the way you knew it. They know the higher ground, which is adequate but not the same, not the landscape that holds the names that carry the knowledge. The names are still spoken, but the places they name are no longer accessible. The place where your grandfather's grandfather is buried is underwater at high tide now. You cannot go there. Your children cannot go there. The knowledge that was encoded in the landscape, not just in the names but in the physical presence of the places, the view from the hill that told you where you were in the world, the sound of the river in the pool below the falls. The knowledge is still in your memory and in the stories you tell, but it is no longer embedded in an accessible reality. It has become mythology. It has become the memory of a place that no one can visit anymore. This is happening now, in the Pacific, to the communities of low-lying islands whose homes are going underwater. The Marshall Islands, the Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu. The people who live on these islands know them in the way the Doggerland people knew their landscape. Not as tourists, not as administrators, but as communities formed by and in relationship with a specific geography over many generations. The knowledge of the reef systems, the knowledge of the seasonal patterns of fish and weather, the knowledge of where each family's history is embedded in the landscape. All of this is at risk of being lost in the same way that the Doggerland community's knowledge was lost through the slow inundation of the places that carry it. The parallel is not perfect, the causes are different, the timescales are different, the communities themselves are different, but the structure of the loss is the same. The sea rises and the place goes under, and the knowledge that was embedded in the place goes under with it. This is why Doggerland matters beyond its intrinsic historical interest. It is not merely a curiosity, an interesting lost landscape, a footnote to the prehistory of northwestern Europe. It is a demonstration of a process that we are watching happen again, in real time, to communities whose relationship to their specific landscapes is as old and as irreplaceable as the Doggerland community's was. The grief for Doggerland is also, if we are paying attention, grief for what is being lost now, and perhaps a kind of argument for why it matters, why the preservation of a community's relationship with its specific landscape matters. What exactly is at stake when that relationship is severed? What cannot be reconstructed once it is gone? The North Sea. I want to come back to the North Sea itself, because I have been speaking about Doggerland as if the North Sea were simply the absence of the land, and that is not quite right. The North Sea is something, not merely the negation of what was there before. It has been a presence in the human world of northwestern Europe for 7,000 years, longer, in the deeper sense that the coastlines existed before the final inundation, and the communities that lived on those coastlines were already in relationship with the sea, already fishing it and travelling it and reading its moods and including it in their understanding of the world. The sea was not a stranger when it came, it was a familiar entity that gradually extended its domain. There is a specific quality of light over the North Sea, in the late afternoon of a clear autumn day, that I find difficult to describe without overstating it. The sea here is never the blue of a Mediterranean or a tropical ocean. It is grey-green, the colour of old pewter, the colour of cold, but in the low autumn light, the water surface catches the angle of the sun and reflects it in a way that makes the horizon seem very close, the light very horizontal and specific, the distinction between the grey of the water and the grey of the sky, very slight and very suggestive. It is not a beautiful light in the conventional sense. It does not make you want to paint it or photograph it. It does not make you reach for adjectives. It makes you quiet. It makes you aware of the scale of what you are looking at and the smallness of where you are standing. It is, in the precise and limited sense that the word allows, a melancholy light. A light that says, time has been here and time will continue, and you are a very brief presence in a very long story. Under that light, the North Sea floor holds the world we have been speaking about. 10,000 years of peat and sediment pressed by the weight of the water above it, recording in its layers the record of what grew and burned and died and accumulated in the world that the water replaced. Somewhere in those layers are the bones of the man who stood in the river in the first light of an autumn morning 9,000 years ago, waiting for the salmon. Somewhere are the bones of the child who stood at the edge of the forest watching the squirrel on its branch. The bones are not there in any form we could identify if we found them. 9,000 years in marine sediment is more than enough to reduce bone to calcium phosphate and calcium phosphate to nothing. But the carbon of their bodies is there, diffused into the sediment, part of the organic record that the seafloor carries of everything that has ever lived in this part of the world. The sea remembers them. The sea does not know that it remembers them. The sea does not know anything. The sea is not that kind of thing. But the record is there, in the chemistry and the sediment and the compressed time of the peat beds, and we are learning to read it, slowly, with the tools of modern science. And in reading it, we are doing something that would have been completely impossible even a generation ago. We are making the invisible world visible again, reconstructing from the evidence of its remains the world that was there before the water came. It is not the same as having the world back. Nothing could be that. The names are still gone. The stories are still gone. The specific knowledge of a specific landscape, accumulated over 10,000 years, is still gone. What we are recovering is the outlines, the shape of the rivers, the distribution of the vegetation, the presence of the animals, the evidence of human activity. We are recovering the fact of the world, rather than the experience of it, and those are very different things. But the fact of the world is not nothing. The fact that there was land here, that people lived on it, that they knew it in the deep and specific way that only comes from a community's relationship with a place over many generations, the fact of all of this is something. It is a kind of testimony, even if it is testimony without a witness, evidence without a statement. The hazel nut from the sea floor. I keep coming back to it. It is the most human of the objects recovered from the submerged landscape of Doggerland, more human even than the skull fragment, because the skull fragment is a biological residue, the leftover of a body, while the hazel nut is a product of attention. Someone was paying attention to the hazel trees in that season. Someone knew that the hazelnuts were ripe, or almost ripe, and was in the vicinity to know this, either harvesting, or passing by on the way to something else, or simply living in the landscape in the way that produces incidental contact with the things growing in it. The nut fell, or was dropped, or was placed, and the conditions of the site preserved it, and 9,000 years later it came up in a core of sediment and was recognized as what it was, and was dated and analyzed, and has now been telling this story for for decades to anyone who will listen. It is a very small story. It is a nut. But the nut is evidence of presence, and presence is evidence of a world, and the world is what we are trying to recover. The nut from the seafloor, the harpoon point from the trawler's net, the skull fragment from the fishing boat's catch, the merest whispers of a civilization that spoke only in air and stone and bone, and the knowledge passed between generations in the dark of winter evenings, when the fire was the only light and the sea was the only sound, and the stories were the only way of holding the world together long enough to live in it. That civilization is gone, the sea has it, but we are still here, on the shores of the same sea, and the light that falls on the water in the late afternoon of a clear autumn day is the same light that fell on the faces of the people who watched the water rise and understood, in whatever way they were capable of understanding such a thing, that the world they had been given was being taken away. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you somewhere specific. Let me take you to the Doggerbank itself, the shallow underwater plateau that was once the highest ground of Doggerland, the last piece of the old world to go under the sea, the place that held out longest against the rising water. The Doggerbank is still there, though it has been under the sea for 7,000 years. It sits at a depth of 15 to 30 meters in the central North Sea, significantly shallower than the surrounding seafloor, and this topographic distinction is why it has always been a productive fishing ground. The shallow water concentrates nutrients and provides the light that the bottom-dwelling species require for the food webs that support the fish. The trawlers that work the bank are following the fish that follow the biology that the geology creates. And the geology creates it because the old land is still there, under the water, unchanged in its basic form, just covered. What the Doggerbank looked like above water in its last centuries, perhaps 8 to 7,000 years ago, we can reconstruct with some confidence from the archaeological and geological evidence. It was a low-lying island, probably well vegetated, surrounded by shallow water that was getting deeper with each passing decade. The island had once been the highest point of a substantial inland area, what is now the central North Sea, and as the surrounding land had been inundated, the communities that had lived in that area would have consolidated onto the remaining high ground. The Doggerbank in its last period would have been a relatively small island, perhaps 200 or 300 kilometers across at its widest, shrinking, with a human population that was the remnant of communities that had once ranged across a much larger landscape. The isolation that comes with island life. The Doggerbank communities, in their last period, were cut off from the mainland populations to the south and east and west by the shallow but growing sea. They could not simply walk to the mainland anymore, as the Mesolithic communities of northwestern Europe had been doing for 10,000 years, following the animal herds and the seasonal resources across a continuous landscape. They needed boats. They may have had boats. The earlier Doggerland communities certainly did, given the evidence of deep-water fish in the middens and the island settlements, and boats would have allowed some contact with the mainland. But the contact would have been different in kind from the continuous, overlapping, largely foot-based connection of the earlier period. It would have been deliberate crossing, under cane at specific times for specific purposes, dependent on weather and the availability of the right boats and the knowledge of the right routes. The communities of the Doggerbank Island in their last centuries were, in this sense, an isolated population, genetically isolated to a degree, culturally isolated to some degree, dependent for their knowledge and their social relationships on the other communities of what had become an archipelago of remnant highlands in the subsiding North Sea plain. They were also, almost certainly, aware that the island was shrinking. They would have noticed the winter storms eating at the coastline, the spring floods reaching further inland than they had the spring before, the low-lying ground around the lake beds and river mouths going permanently wet in ways that were new and troubling. They could not have known that the process would end with their world completely underwater, but they could have known, and people who pay as close attention to their landscape as these communities would have paid would almost certainly have known that the direction of change was not toward more land, but toward less. What do you do with that knowledge? What do you do when you understand that the place you live is being taken from you by a force you cannot oppose on a timescale that makes resistance meaningless? The options available to the Doggerbank communities were limited. They could move. The mainland was not so far away that a crossing was impossible, and there were mainland communities to receive them. communities of similar cultural background who spoke the same or similar languages and shared the same basic way of life. They could stay. Staying was always an option, until the moment it wasn't, and the human tendency to remain in a known place until departure becomes absolutely necessary is well documented. They could do both, some families leaving, some staying, the community thinning over generations as more and more people made the crossing to the mainland, and the remaining population grew smaller and older, and eventually too small to sustain itself. We do not know which of these happened or in what combination. The archaeology of the Dogger Bank is, for obvious reasons, almost impossible to conduct. The bank is underwater, it is actively fished in ways that disturb the sediment, and the depth is enough to make sampling difficult and expensive. What we know about the bank's last period as land comes primarily from the sediment cores and from the rare recoveries of surface material by the trawlers. It is not enough to tell the human story with any confidence. All we can say, with confidence, is that the bank was inhabited at some point in the late Mesolithic, and that at some point it was not inhabited, and that the transition between those two states happened as the sea rose and the land area shrank to nothing. The transition from habitation to emptiness. This is the moment I keep trying to reach, the moment when the last human beings on the Dogger Bank acknowledged, in whatever way they acknowledged such things, that the island was no longer livable and made the crossing to the mainland, or the moment when the last of them was taken by the sea before they could make the crossing. By a storm perhaps, or by the slow inundation of the last dry ground, the water rising around them while they slept. We will never know how it ended. We know only that it ended. The mainland that received the Dogger Bank refugees, if they came to the mainland rather than simply disappearing with the island, was itself a transformed landscape. The Britain that existed 7,000 years ago was already substantially smaller than the Britain of the height of Doggerland. Already an island separated from the European mainland by the channel that had opened a few thousand years earlier as the southern North Sea was flooded. The forests were dense and the animals were there, and the Mesolithic communities of Britain were well established. But the landscape was different from the one the Dogger Bank people had known. It was mainland landscape, continuous, connected, not surrounded by water. The skills and the knowledge that had been appropriate to the island world of the Dogger Bank would have needed revision for the mainland context. Some things would have transferred directly. The fishing knowledge, the hunting knowledge, the knowledge of how to read weather and sky and animal behavior. Other things would not transfer at all. The specific knowledge of a specific landscape that was no longer accessible. The names and the stories and the ritual relationships with places that no longer existed above water. The mainland Mesolithic communities that absorbed the Dogger Bank refugees. If the refugees came in numbers large enough to be detectable in the archaeological record, which is unlikely, would have changed them as much as they changed them. The specific knowledge of the island world would have faded within a generation or two, replaced by the knowledge of the mainland landscape that was now the only landscape available. The children born on the mainland to parents who had grown up on the Dogger Bank would have known the mainland. Their knowledge of the island would have come from their parents' stories, growing more distant and less specific with each generation, until it became myth, the story of the land their ancestors came from, the world that was there before the water, the place with no name that was known before memory. Every mythology that has been studied carefully enough contains traces of a catastrophic flood, a great inundation that destroyed a previous world. The stories vary enormously in their details and their moral frameworks and the surviving remnant and the deity responsible, but the structural element is shared across a surprising number of traditions. There was a world before the flood, and the flood took it, and the world we live in now is the world that came after. Scholars have debated for generations whether these myths reflect actual memory of specific flood events, whether the Noah story reflects the flooding of the Black Sea Basin, whether various Pacific flood myths reflect the inundation of coastal lands during the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. And the debate has not been resolved and perhaps cannot be resolved because the mechanisms by which specific historical events might be encoded in mythological narratives and transmitted across many thousands of years are not well understood. But it is not impossible that somewhere in the mythological traditions of northwestern Europe, traditions that are largely lost to us because the cultures that held them did not write, and by the time writing arrived in Britain, the traditions had been transformed by Iron Age and then by Christianity into forms we cannot easily read back to their origins. There was a memory of the world before the North Sea, a memory of a time when you could walk to the continent, when the rivers were different and the land was wider, and the people of what is now Britain and what is now Denmark and what is now the Netherlands were not separated by water but connected by land. This memory, if it existed, would have been very old by the time of the historical record. 7,000 years old, encoded in narrative forms that have been revised and reinterpreted many times over, probably unrecognizable as a memory of a specific historical reality. But it would have been there, somewhere in the sediment of the oral tradition, carrying the shape of the loss even when the specific content had been transformed into something else. We cannot recover it. Like the rest of Doggerland's heritage, it has sunk below the level at which we can reach it. We can only note its likely existence and acknowledge the silence where it should be, the silence of Doggerland. I want to end here with the silence, because the silence is what this story is ultimately about. Not the geology, not the archaeology, not the theoretical reconstruction of the landscape and the way of life. These are the means of approaching the silence, the ways we have of getting close to it. But the silence itself is the thing, the silence where the names were, the silence where the stories were, the silence where 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge about a specific place and how to live in it used to be. It is a very old silence, 7,000 years old at a minimum, and in some ways much older, because the knowledge began accumulating 12,000 years ago, when the first communities moved into the warming landscape of the post-glacial North Sea plain, and the silence began at the end of that accumulation, whenever the last person who carried the knowledge of Doggerland died or was absorbed into a community that did not know what they carried. The silence is as old as the North Sea, which is old enough. I stand at the edge of the North Sea sometimes, the English coast, the Yorkshire coast that faces east toward the submerged landscape, and I look out at the water and I try to see through it, which is impossible. The water is opaque, grey-green, reflecting the sky. I cannot see the sea floor. I cannot see the old landscape, the river channels and the lake beds and the hazel thickets and the places where people camped for generations. I cannot see any of it. The sea is between us and it, 7 to 30 meters of cold North Sea, and that is a very effective barrier. But the water is the same water that fell as rain on the Dogger Bank 9,000 years ago, and drained into the rivers that flowed across the old landscape to the sea. The rain fell on the hazel leaves, and on the backs of the red deer, and on the faces of the people who stood in the rain and felt it and named it in a language we no longer know. The water that fell on them is the water in the sea that covers them. It moved as water moves from the land to the sea, and from the sky to the land and back again, in the endless cycle that moves water through the world on timescales that make human history seem brief. The rain that fell on Doggerland is in the North Sea. The North Sea is the rain that fell on Doggerland. This is not a comfort exactly, but it is something, a connection, tenuous but real, between us and the world we are mourning. The water that fell on them falls on us. The sky above the North Sea is the same sky that was above it when there was land below. The stars that navigated the people of Doggerland are the stars that navigate us. The light that will fall on the sea tomorrow morning is the same light that fell on the landscape when the landscape was there, filtered through the same atmosphere, reflected from the same sun. Everything that was material about that world has been transformed or dissolved or dispersed. But the light is the same light. The fishermen who work the Dogger Bank do not think about any of this. They think about the weather and the quota and the price of diesel and whether the net is holding. They do their work in a landscape they understand in the practical, accumulated, passed-down way that the Mesolithic communities understood their landscape. Knowing where the fish are and when, knowing how to read the sky and the sea surface and the behaviour of the birds, knowing the specific geography of the bank and its channels and its productive corners in the way that only comes from long familiarity. Their knowledge is newer knowledge, Viking and Hanseatic and English fishing knowledge, built up over 1,000 years rather than 10,000. But it has the same structure, a community in relationship with a specific place, accumulating specific knowledge over generations, holding it in the body and the practice rather than in texts. They are, in this formal sense, the latest inhabitants of the same geography that the Doggerland people inhabited before them. Different people, different knowledge, the same cold grey water, the same convergence of depth and current and nutrient that makes the bank productive century after century. Occasionally, as I said, a net comes up with something in it that does not belong. The fisherman holds it for a moment, the tooth dark with age, the fragment of worked antler, the piece of bone that has been at the bottom of the sea since before history. He turns it in his hands. He does not know what to do with it. It is not from his world, it is from the world under his world, the world that his world replaced, the world that the North Sea covers, and occasionally, in a moment of geological accident, briefly returns. The light on the North Sea in the early morning, before the weather has had time to build, when the surface is relatively calm and the sky is pale and the distinction between water and air is reduced to the faintest difference in luminosity. That light is very old. It fell on Doggerland. It falls on us. Between the two fallings, it has fallen on everything that has happened in this part of the world for 10,000 years, on every generation of people who have stood at this edge and looked out at this water and felt, in whatever way they were capable of feeling it, the weight of what the water contains. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.